Matt, we're using your Zoom this time because I think we've both been looking forward to this conversation. I know I have, and
Absolutely.
we
Yeah.
agreed to maybe let this go slightly longer than my normal free thing that boots people off at 45 minutes, but let's try not to be too indulgent.
Indeed. Yeah.
I do have a lot I want to get into, so if you don't mind, can I just start by asking you some questions? Or,
For sure. Let's hop in.
all right,
And
fuck.
thank you for having me, I should say. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. No, thank you for being on here. Matt. You are a founding member of New Ritual Press, the host of Strange Flows podcast, and you've written at least two books, one of which I've
hmm
a collection titled The Black Album. I love this collection and find it fascinating for a number of reasons, but before we get into the nature of your book, I'd like to recount how we met.
Yeah.
About a year ago, you showed up to a reading with Omar King, a mutual friend whose debut collection you published and who has recently become a rising star in the Los Angeles literary scene. At the time, I had no idea who you were, but you, me, and Omar ended up jumping on a Zoom conversation, which would end up on both of our podcasts or YouTube channels. The focus of that conversation was Omar's work and to a lesser degree mine, but somewhere in the midst, you alluded to the fact that you were also a writer and that your work shared some similarities with mine. You said, and I quote, I'm also very influenced by the Dennis Cooper thing, that kind of boy who wants to be destroyed for sexual reasons or maybe pure
Yeah.
catharsis. Um, and after that conversation, you were kind enough to send me a copy of your collection, the Black Album. I read it slowly alongside several books I was consuming for the purposes of this conversation series. However, I remember wanting to blast through those books more quickly so that I'd have more time to spend with yours because the
Thank
Black
you.
Album, yeah, because the Black Album does feel like something in my wheelhouse, but also wholly new and exciting. In short, the Black Album is a collection of stories and essays that feel entrenched in a kind of young masculinity, a space where sincere philosophical and spiritual yearning collides with a bombastic death drive. You explore the volatile nature of niche online spaces, aggressive music culture, personal conflicts in regards to violence and sexuality, the spectrum of occultism and traditional religion in contemporary life, and your own search for philosophical truth, which has led you into the maze of dissident right wing ideologies, many of which you seem to embrace. And yet your text offers no real conclusions other than that these schools of thought be taken seriously, at least as much as their radical counterparts on the left. This last part
Mhm.
is interesting, at least to me, because I grew up in a different space wherein radical left wing ideology, especially in regards to sexual politics, seemed most aligned with my sense of self. Yet I, like many aging millennials, have witnessed a cultural shift over the past several years in which young people are overwhelmingly gravitating toward the right and in ways that seem misaligned with our interpretation of what that should mean. You write toward
hmm
the end of your book that the academic and perhaps prevailing progressive cultural view is that the right wing, aside from thuggish abstractions of Nazism and fascism, begins and ends with Fox News, Donald Trump, and the Republican Party, the province of low intelligence or low information voters. So I'm sorry to put you in the role of de facto ambassador for this world, but what does it mean to be involved in dissident right-wing ideologies in 2025? And did you write this book with that audience in mind? Or is the Black Album, like most any piece of serious literature, an attempt to explore these ideas in service to the aesthetics of the text? Sorry, the aesthetics of the text. I realize the last portion of that question gives away my point of view, but let's hear yours.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for having me and for such a thought out initial question. To answer, I guess, the easiest part of your question first, and to, I guess, engage in some degree of self-criticism. I think very much the book was written for a dissident right audience. That doesn't necessarily mean I was trying to play into those ideas without nuance. Maybe I was trying to challenge them or add nuance, and I think I was trying to do that. But very much, maybe to the book's discredit, I'll even say it was. As you introduced me, I Strange Flows is my podcast. I have a longer history with a podcast called New Right. That's New WRITE. So it's mostly about literature, but yeah, it's part of that sort of Red Scare podcast adjacent, Bronze Age Pervert world, dissident right, our side of Twitter thing, and definitely when I was writing the Black Album, I reference it's very self-referential to being involved in that podcast, being involved in that space. It was written with that audience in mind, for the pragmatic reason that I knew at that time, and I think maybe it's finding slightly bigger audience now, which is great. Especially as I've become associated with Omar and a more apolitical side of the sort of literary sphere, shall we say. So
Right.
I'm grateful for that. But initially, I was anticipating that those would be the people who listen to New Right podcast would be the ones who buy it. A lot of the essays in it were written on Substack, so very much placed into that side of Twitter. It was pretty straightforwardly written for that audience. But that being said, obviously you've enjoyed it. Other people who'd be even more unexpected to enjoy it have enjoyed it. I do think it transcends that world in parts, or perhaps even would serve as a good prime. I hesitate to say primer because I think the ideas in it are fairly unique to me. I don't think I represent necessarily the heart of what the online Twitter sphere is by any means. But I think it's a cultural artifact, shall we say, of that space, as a lot of literary products and other cultural products are. But I think it transcends it in a lot of ways that it can be enjoyed. It's written in a way. I mean, I think it helps to know some of the references, but I also think the references to various online figures and even my own kind of metafictional mythologizing of myself. I think all of that is, and I'm curious if you agree. I think all of that is unpacked in a way that would make sense. I mean, I think it probably helps to be like millennial and down, probably, but for the most part, I think if you're of our general generation and down, you could kind of find your way into this. What was the term you used? Is that does it transcend its own?
Oh,
That
so
sounded very good. Yeah.
well, it's does it like most any piece of serious literature an attempt to explore these ideas in service to the aesthetics of the text? Meaning
Mhm.
it like reading the book, I get the idea that you are involved or are involved in this sort of like right-wing ideology. It's sort of painted across the book, and yet there aren't real conclusions being made as in terms of like your ideological positions, which I
Definitely. Yeah.
actually really enjoy. And yet I'm sort of curious where there's a lot. I mean, you do get into this, and maybe I should just ask the next question, but what I was trying to get at is there may be even a certain audience for this conversation series, which is like, what the fuck are you doing, Chris? And I sort of think in 2025, it's like a lot of these ideological spaces are kind of fracturing, and
Yeah.
I
Oh,
can't
absolutely.
put anyone in a niche anymore because like all of the attributes I would give to someone who's on the left or right sort of are meaningless anymore or are
They've
meaning
certainly significantly lost resonance. I would agree, and I'm not an ideologue, as I think has always been clear. Whatever podcast I was doing, whatever I was writing,
right.
I've never been someone who has an opinion and espouses it unless I really feel like I've earned it from long periods of thinking about things. Like the essay that maybe is the most overtly political, the last essay, and one of the ones you quoted from in terms of the Fox News thing. The Politics of Aesthetics Revisited. I wrote that in 2020, so it's now 5 years old, which is funny to think. But I think this wasn't even how I was thinking about it when I wrote it, and it's similar with the other essay you quoted from, which is the uh, what is it called? The Renaissance of the Ritual, which is taken from Mike Ma's book. That's another tangent, but those two sort of more, I guess you could say more political, but also more like meta political essays were things that I really took kind of years of playing with the different ideas to feel good enough to put something sort of political down on the page because I'm not someone who just spits
Sure.
various right wing talking points. It's really like if I can locate the kernel of something like this is my view on occultism and traditional religion in the case of the one essay, or this is the role that I think aesthetics should have in politics and why that is maybe right of center in certain ways.
Okay, well,
over enough
hold on. I'm going to
time.
stop you
Yeah.
really quick because I feel like we're talking in really large abstractions, and I want to get into some questions to get more specific about both your ideas in a literary sense and maybe ideology, if that makes any sense here. Is that cool? All right. So my next question for you is, I, like many straight leading millennial men, have mostly come into contact with things like astrology and tarot via my
Mhm.
relationships with women. So your frequent inclusion of these ideas or practices in your writing almost feel like a cultural recontextualization for me. The way
Mhm.
you go about this is not entirely without humor. For example, you begin a short story titled My Saturn Return with a quote from Limp Bizkit's Fred Durst via their Woodstock 99 performance. Durst is quoted saying, "Reach deep down inside and take all that negative energy and let that shit out of your fucking system." But you go on to write, I think, with great sincerity about the role that heavy metal and certainly the concert experience with its mosh pits and so on plays in contemporary masculinity. And I quote, "The delivery of that deeply craved male on male impact and violence missed in a society absent the need to go to war or join a gang or whatever else men and boys in societies and social milieus with a good use for male energy do. I'd intuited that I'd grown up in a society, or at least a suburban social milieu within a society, in which male energy was not allowed to flourish and instead was treated as an obstacle to be dealt with like hazardous waste. Later, you accompany your short story Funky Town with an image of a tarot card, and I'm not going to pretend I know what the meaning of this card is. But Funky Town is perhaps the most viscerally disarming piece in your collection, as it discusses in great detail the real world cartel snuff video, which has come to be called Funky Town among its online audience because it depicts a man being dismembered, the skin peeled from his face, all while he's kept conscious via an adrenaline drip. The song by Lips Inc. plays softly in the background. I'm curious as to your background in astrology, tarot, and other more esoteric forms of mysticism, and how you see these practices as relevant to your vision of masculinity, at least in the context of this book.
Yeah, definitely. This is in some ways probably the better place to start.
Okay.
Yeah, it's funny you say that about astrology and tarot, and especially in LA, maybe, or actually probably especially everywhere else, but including LA. It's something that one associates with girlfriends, women they meet, the what's your sign question on the dating app, that sort of thing.
Right.
I'm I guess you could say a comer to all of it. I had some passing interest in certain occult topics, certainly throughout my life. But even when I would kind of flirt with those earlier in life, it was like, but we can't, you know, it can't boil down to astrology. Like that's just unbelievably lame, overly complicated, definitely female coded. Not, not that that right wing ideas and masculinity being explored in the book, though they are. I've never been afraid to be in touch with my feminine side, I guess. So that wasn't really the main deterrent, but just it didn't seem like it was for me. And I was like, even as I was initially getting more into occultism at age like 26, 27, it still seemed like, yeah, but not the astrology stuff, just like chaos magic, right? And then eventually you realize, okay, in tarot and astrology, obviously we could differentiate the two things. Obviously, tarot is the traditional deck with its series of meanings, and astrology is the traditional, calendar and position in the sky with its set of meanings. But they are deeply, deeply interrelated. Obviously, tarot maps onto the astrological symbols really well. We're dealing with the same kind of thing with both of them, which is a Carl Jung would call it like a vocabulary of the collective unconscious. These different signifiers, these different signs, whether it's Gemini or Sagittarius, have meanings in terms of how people understand themselves, how people understand certain events, actions, the whole nine yards, and all the cards of the tarot. Similarly, I know I'm being very broad here, but I guess we have to because I can't. I'm not going to spell out what everything in the tarot means, but
Sure.
suffice it to say, it's a self-contained set of signs and symbols with meanings. and with deep-seated meanings. I think we even very skeptical people would probably recognize that these are ancient symbols with ancient meanings pertaining to different elements of the human psyche, the human experience. The tarot card you mentioned at the front of the Funky Town story is the Hanged Man, and as you said, won't pretend you know exactly what it means. That's the more straightforward one in a way, though, right? It's the Hanged Man. It's
Okay.
I mean, it is more nuanced. It is a lot more nuanced than this, but on the other hand, maybe the most basic meaning is instructive enough. It's shit luck. It's it's having something very bad happen to you, right?
Okay, fair enough.
So agnostic. I'm not really. I certainly don't really. Well, I'm not the one who cares about like who my romantic and sexual partners, what their sign is. That's not really me. I'm kind of agnostic as to slash leaning skeptical as to the real influence of these things about when you were born. So in that sense, I'm not like a true astrology believer. But what I can definitely say is I think that the vocabulary and the oppositions that are set up can be a really rich way to understand your own experience and understand the world um, in a way that can be enlightening for personal use, at least.
Well, so can you talk about some practical ways in which you use this stuff, particularly ritual? Because you actually do go into this in the book, mostly in reference to like a Mike Ma piece or something. I'm not
Yeah,
familiar with him, but you do talk about this directly in terms of your life and in terms of your identity as a man, right?
yeah,
Can you
no,
talk a little bit about that? Okay.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. I probably again, yeah, I'm not as in deep water astrology as a lot of people are.
Okay.
But I certainly
Well, it doesn't need to be astrology,
right, yeah,
whatever.
yeah, I
Yeah.
certainly read tarot for other people when asked, and for myself, and I've found it has been instructive. Or it's not always as simple as like did this thing come true? Although sometimes it does. I just find it helpful as a way to just sort through my own thoughts using tarot and use it and thinking about what X, Y, or Z might mean. A really weird comparison would be the way people use like Chat GPT now to like do their own therapy,
Yeah, yeah,
which I've
okay.
also dabbled in. Like kind of taking anxieties and concerns you have and like asking Chat GPT and it spits something back at you. And I think at its best, it tells you what you already know, but it's nice to see it externalized. Um,
Right.
Side topic, but I've interestingly with AI, that is kind of would be my approach to tarot is basically so in a sort of Jungian way, engaging with my own unconscious, and mapping it out with pictures and symbols in a way that sometimes is really helpful. Sometimes it's like, oh yes, this connection makes sense, and this is something I should look out for. And other times is less helpful. I'm a little bit agnostic about it in the sense I don't think it's like always like the oracle speaks or anything like that.
Sure.
But I find it helpful in a creative approach to my own unconscious, the contents of my own mind, kind of working through things. It can certainly backfire too. It can make me more neurotic, but other times it's been helpful. And then in terms of astrology, like yeah, I think of I I almost cringe to admit it in a way, but like at this point, I do think of myself as a Sagittarius, which I am. That has become not like one of the biggest things about me, but like you let these things in your life for better or worse, and
So
you start seeing it everywhere.
what
Yeah.
is the sort of overarching theme of the Sagittarius?
Yeah, I would say, and so to start with the symbol, it's an archer shooting an
Okay.
arrow, right? And it's considered the most philosophical of signs. And long before I was at all into astrology, we're talking, maybe 20 years before I even really let myself think about it for more than 2 seconds. It was actually a Doors record. Jim Morrison stage banter. He was also a Sagittarius, talking about how he's the Sagittarius, the most philosophical of signs, and then he later says he thinks it's bullshit. But
Okay.
that stuck with me even at the age of like 15 because it's like I do think of myself as first and foremost being a philosophical person. So that was the first moment. I was like, well, I'm sure it's a coincidence, but yeah, that is kind of me. But to answer it, yeah, all of these things, and it's hard to tell. Maybe this is a sign that they're more bullshit, or maybe it's a sign that there's more nuance there. But all of them have sort of these weird interrelated. It's always an oversimplification when you see the chart that's like a Sagittarius is boom,
Sure.
boom, boom.
Okay.
Like it's it's a series of different traits and different energies, right? And you kind of have to weave them together for yourself a little bit. Like the most philosophical of signs, the most sort of teacherly of signs. It's a sign that would be associated with a lot of like professors or even maybe priests or something, which is also I would say a big part of my personality. And then, but also on another vantage on it is, it's a very adventurous sign. It's a sign that really requires a lot of freedom and open space to be happy and satisfied. And the question is like, how do all those things come together? In my mind, it makes sense. It's like intellectually as well as physically, you need to kind of be above the muck of it all, and you need to be operating in this big picture way, where you're both free in your personal life, to have that sort of leeway, but also even philosophically, in order to effectively think philosophically, you can't be tied down by these more mundane things. So for me, those two ideas are very related. And then the sort of more teacherly element of it is, very naturally, if you are a free spirit in that way, and a philosophical person in that way, there's going to be this desire to pass that on to others. So I don't know if that's what I've just given there would be a particularly effective way to bring over a non-believer, but you can see how you kind of can delve into these kinds of symbols, whether it's an astrological symbol that you resonate with, or is your sun sign, or if it's a tarot card as part of a reading, you can imbue all of these different meanings into it and create meaning for yourself. Um, whether, it's like at worst, making it all up, right? But that's still kind of a creative and meaningful act. And at best, maybe there's a little more synchronicity there, shall we say, a more genuine mapping on of whatever it is I'm doing up here to contextualize my life with something that's actually happening beyond me. Um,
I get that. Okay.
yeah,
Cool. All right, let's move on. Let's talk a bit about your literary influences, as
yeah.
this book is such an amalgamation of seemingly disparate voices. You mentioned in the text some writers and artists like Dennis Cooper, David Lynch, and Thomas Ligotti, whose influences I think create aesthetic parallels between your work and the literary scene I've sort of come up in.
Mm.
You also bring up many of the often discussed philosophers and academics, Nietzsche, Camille Paglia, Deleuze, Hegel, etc. But then you also tie in some very contemporary writers who, to my knowledge, have mostly come into popularity via dissident right-wing online spaces. Some of these writers I've heard of, like Bronze Age Pervert or BAP. Others, like Mike Ma, I've only discovered via reading your book. I'm hoping you could talk about your literary or media consumption, if there's an aesthetic tradition you feel like you work in. And then maybe you can talk about some of these newer writers like Mike Ma and Bap and what the fuck is going on with their kind of memeified aliases.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's a story with like some starts and stops, I guess. I think I very much started writing fiction first with David Foster Wallace as the big influences, which I think is fairly common for people and guides, especially about my age.
Sure.
Um,
Wait, how old are
Wallace,
you, just first of all?
I'm 30.
Okay.
So yeah, like, I was, however old I was, a young teenager when David Foster Wallace killed himself. He was kind of then a renewed interest. transpired after that, and he was the guy for many years, and then he was kind of his legacy sort of came into question a little bit around 2014. But by that time, I had really imbibed a lot of it, and still love Wall. Maybe that's in many ways still the writer who made me want to write, and that's still the case. Still a big fan. The way he could kind of put you in the skin of his characters. I don't know if you've read much Wallace, but just that hyper self-conscious style, and literature that kind of makes the reader feel less lonely, very teenage for me. Going, being a more isolated person at the time, that's kind of what drew me in, and I wanted to be able to do that. That influence was later really shaken up quite a bit. Bret Easton Ellis wrote a big takedown of David Foster Wallace, and I think he'd have more nuanced takes on now. But in 2014, around the time the Jesse Eisenberg, Jason Segel movie, The End of the Tour, came out, he was like, Bret really sort of took the beatification of David Foster Wallace down. And for me, I've always been, and this ties into some of the political stuff too. I've always been someone who's very much attracted to opposites, and definitely, like, if I'm really into something, I also want to thoroughly explore the best counter argument. So when this Bret Easton Ellis takedown came out, I was initially like felt defensive of David Foster Wallace. I'd only seen American Psycho, hadn't read any of his books, and I was like, well, maybe he's got some points. Time to dive into Bret Easton Ellis, which is what I did. I think I found, or was led to, Dennis Cooper, not directly by Bret Easton Ellis. A lot of my influence also comes from like music, I guess, and I think Dennis Cooper was on the list of like Jamie Stewart from Shoo Shoo and the lead singer of Deer Hunter. Like, so eventually get to Dennis Cooper as well, but by that like mid to late college, that's sort of more, however you'd even define whatever Bret Easton Ellis and Dennis Cooper have in common, became much more the overriding influence. That kind of punk lit, very male focused. You could say masculinist, but not really, because it's a lot queerer than that. But certainly very male focused and male energy focused.
Yeah, absolutely.
That so David Foster Wallace, as much as an influence as he was and still is, like, I don't think I've ever read Wallace and then like written something good because I read it. But I think Dennis Cooper and Bret Easton Ellis spoke much more to something I could actually put down on the page, like a more musical style almost, in a weird way. Not that their prose are musical, but they brought and this ties into the Black Album thing. They brought like a certain punk rock, or just rock and roll in general energy that I was like, okay, I don't have to be pretentious with creative writing. It should be very direct and to the point in the same way that music can be. And that kind of that sort of unlocked my brain a little bit in college. And my first book, Dragon Day, which is the other one, I will definitely give you a copy at some point.
Cool.
I think you will like it. I don't say that lightly. I don't, I'm not always, I try to avoid pimping out my work too much. As you can attest, I think I did. We had that chat with Omar. I kind of brought up my book incidentally, and then eventually we were in the same place. Like, I happen to have a copy here.
Right.
If you want to read it, I'm not a big fan of. I should probably self promote myself more, but yeah, Dragon Day was kind of like my college novel. That's very Bret Easton Ellis and Dennis Cooper influence. That is kind of ground zero for a lot of these themes.
Real quick, just when
Yeah,
talking about the name, the Black Album. When I first saw that, I thought this was like a Joan Didion reference. Is
it
that?
is.
Oh, it
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah.
It is. How big is Joan Didion an influence on me? Mm, only to the extent that she was like an influence on Bret Easton Ellis, I guess. But
I'm very
I
similar.
really,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You're very similar in the sense of liking Joan Didion, but not as it's not as direct of a line. Yeah,
Meaning, yeah, because like obviously Brett has talked so much about her, and
yeah.
I also got an older friend of mine who lent me some of her books. I find her essays amazing. I actually hate her novels, even though I think they are a big vibe influence
Hmm.
on
I
Brett.
like the essays better too. Yeah,
I just think they're kind of boring by today's standards, if I'm being quite honest, because
yeah. I've only read Play It As It Lays, which I do like, but I haven't been especially compelled to read the others. Yeah,
fair enough. Yeah, anyway, but yes, meaning like she influenced people who I have a direct influence. I think
yeah.
that. basically what I'm getting at. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. And so I do like that book, The White Album, and I have it and enjoy it. But I think it was kind of in terms of the Black Album, that was like an aesthetic influence. It's like I'll do my own version of this, and then, there's some structural similarity. Like that's a collection of essays. Black Album is like half a collection of essays. It
Yeah.
was playing with that reference, but yeah. I guess to continue on the wavelength of like my own influences, the dissident right. What would you say memification?
Well,
Yeah,
so I mean, let's take Bronze Age Pervert as an example, or the other one that I know and almost got introduced to is a guy who goes by Delicious Tacos.
yeah,
And part of, and I've told this to your face, part of my apprehension in getting into some of these writers at all is that from the outside it kind of feels silly. Like there's like
yeah,
a memification of hiding behind an identity, which I think has some practical purpose because of some of the
yeah,
ideological stuff. But if you're saying I wrote this serious book and I wrote it under the name Bronze Age Pervert, there's already kind of a connotation around that. But I just kind of curious what your perspective is.
yeah. I think and this ties maybe a little bit into the first question you asked, which I didn't really answer. Maybe by the end of this, I'll have answered in some way, which is
Okay.
what does it mean to be dissident right nowadays? I don't know, to be
Okay.
clear, but I have to think of something to say, right? And I have to exemplify this in some way.
Well, I
But
think
yeah,
I'll also say it's a kind of unfair question. And
no, it's okay.
okay.
And
But I mean, if
and
I ask
again,
someone, what does it mean to be uh, a left-wing anarchist or something? I mean, this has many answers, right? So
right,
but
right.
I am curious specifically about your point of view, if
Yeah,
you,
I'll keep thinking about it.
okay.
I think yeah, like as you said, the Black Album like does not really have answers so much as questions, which is accurate, and it's a moving target for me too. But to go back to the sort of dissident right, the pantheon of dissident right authors who, whether I like it or not, whether or not I disavow now or in 3 years, had a significant influence on me. I mean, I think that the anonymity angle, it starts as a pragmatic thing. Now, of course, I think both Bronze Age Pervert and Delicious Tacos have kind of been doxxed since then, so the cat is out of the bag. But
Oh, okay.
initially, I think it was rightly or correctly or not, there was a sense that this stuff had to be anonymous, so that people didn't lose jobs, people weren't tracked by whatever interest group who doesn't like what they're saying. Um, so it had a real pragmatic purpose, but I think that your reaction is the same as what a lot of the general public would be. It's like, well, why does it have to be this goofy? I mean, I'm of two minds about this because like there is a certain humor to the memification of it all. Whether you're calling yourself
Sure.
delicious tacos, if you have Bronze Age mindset is literally written in a kind of weird online pigeon, which I find I've always found charming and enjoyed, but a lot of people just can't get past it, and
Sure.
I get that too. I mean, I think we're at a point now where the need for that has run its course. Of course, depending on what you're saying. If you're saying truly horrific shit, then yeah, it's not a good idea to say it under your own name. But also, I'm not going to be reading that stuff anyway. Like, I'm not into that stuff. I'm into interesting, nuanced stuff, which I will go to the bat and say that Bronze Age mindset is certainly Delicious Tacos, who's himself not even right wing at all, but just kind of was dealing in a sort of manosphere,
Right.
somewhat spicy sexual world where he wanted to keep things private. Which is interesting that I know you almost were paired up with him to do a reading
Yeah.
long before he was even. I mean, he's much more of a not a household name, but he's much better known now. I probably as you are too in literature at least. But that pairing would have been interesting because I mean, yeah, both of you are
I'd
writing
still
about
be open to
sex.
it.
Yeah,
Certainly now. I think back then it was just a schedule conflict. But I
we should do
didn't.
it. We should do it. Yeah, you
All right,
can
fair
set it
enough.
up
Okay.
sometime. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be
Okay.
cool. Um,
Um. Anyway, continue.
yeah, I mean, basically, I do think we're at, and this ties into the first question you asked about what it means to be dissident, right? I think we're past the age where it's important or even particularly desirable to have this character, and that we should all do things like I'm doing, wisely or not, coming on here my own face and name, and just listen. I mean, I don't know. Like, obviously, Bronze Age Pervert he is very influential on me. I think he's a very good, to make it really simple, a very good gloss on Nietzsche, who's always been influential on me. But in other ways, he and I are very different in that his book is an exhortation. His book is, this is the way the world is, and this is what you should do about it. Where in the Black Album is almost the opposite of that. The Black Album is like, I'm much more I don't even know what a good comparison is. I'm just trying to figure this stuff out in real time, I guess, and share that with other people. And whether or not that makes for good literature is up to the reader. So what am I saying with this? Obviously, if you are someone who's a little more like Bronze Age Pervert, I can understand why there's a need for that kind of samizdat, dangerous political text thing. But someone like me, I mean, I'm not going to make some bogus name and be like, this is my philosophy, follow it, because I'm much more interested. I think a lot of dissident right people would think I was a kind of a pussy for this or something, but like, I'm much more interested in just like connecting with people.
Yeah.
Like from across all kinds of spectrums and sharing my own yearning for greater understanding and meaning. I think that's, if I had to say anything that makes me tick, it would be that. I don't mean to go on a tangent, but this has kind of been, maybe this is an interesting
Okay. Go for
one.
it.
It ties into someone that you knew, I think, and that other watchers of this may know. You remember, what was her, did she have a pen name? Uh, Elizabeth Allnut. What was her?
Elizabeth Aldrich?
Aldrich. I've got the name wrong. Sorry.
Yeah.
What was her
Oh, right.
author name? Hold on, let me grab the book
I'm
really quick.
fucking.
Yeah,
I thought, did she not
yeah.
under Elizabeth Aldrich? Hold on.
Sorry, I don't know why I'm overthinking this, but
I thought she went by Eris online, like
yeah, she went by Eris, but no,
but I think
she
she
did. Right,
published under Elizabeth Aldrich.
she did. Yes,
Yeah, because like I have that book that oh God, who put it out?
it
You're
was.
putting me on the spot. I'm really bad sometimes with
No,
like
it's Expat.
names.
Expat
Yeah,
Press put it out.
expat,
Yeah,
right. No,
yeah.
she was kind of an extraordinary emerging voice and then sadly passed. I think the general consensus is that she OD'd. Your
Yes, yeah.
camera
Sorry.
just went off. I don't know if that was on purpose.
Oh, sorry. I was looking for the book. I apologize.
Oh, okay, no worries. Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
but yes, Elizabeth Aldrich. One of the early astrology. So she was super into astrology, and she's kind of would be the more typical person who'd be into astrology, I guess.
Yeah, I
And
actually remember encountering
yeah,
that a little bit. Okay.
she was really into reading. She was the first person who ever read my chart.
Really?
Um, I don't
You
know
were
if
you
this is
were
just.
close with Elizabeth?
I would not say. I would say briefly, kind of close. Yeah. I knew her basically the year she passed away, like a few months. Me and Dan Baltic, my new right co-host, did a great podcast with her in her house in Northridge. And she
Oh,
read my
wow.
chart. This was when I was like, I'd gotten into a little bit into tarot, but it was just astrology still seemed a little weird. And anyway, I bring this up because I think to me it's kind of sentimental, and also she's a good reference point for you and for other people who may be watching this. But long story short, she read my chart and she said, the purpose of your life is to communicate. And I think about that all the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Astrology skeptics will be like, that's just like a typical, and it is, but like the way it was framed, I'm not saying it proves astrology was real, but I think about it all the time. And I think it's true. Sorry, I don't know how we got here. I just, that story came to my mind. I was like, that's
No, I
the
appreciate
type
you
of thing
sharing
we
that.
could bounce off. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for people who are listening to this and don't know who Elizabeth Aldrich is or was, she lived in the Valley, same as you, right?
Yeah.
And for at least a year or two, had kind of, I don't know, was just reaching out to a lot of
Yeah.
writers of a similar age or maybe a generation above or below, and was an absolute sweetheart, really
Yeah. She was great.
vocal.
Yeah.
You could tell she had a little bit of a drug addiction, which I think was unfortunately the way she passed. But
Yeah.
she was actually a phenomenal writer and put out this book. What the fuck is it called? Do you have
Ruthless Little Things. Yeah.
Ruthless Little
I
Things?
couldn't
Right, right.
remember her name for a second, but I
Yeah,
know it's
yeah.
Ruthless Little Things. Yeah.
No, she sent
Um,
we sent each other books around that time too, and I met her once at a reading. She came to Stories, kind of had this mousy little affectation. She was like
yeah.
very shy to read, but the book is extraordinary, and I think it's probably still available with Expat, I would
I
assume.
think it's still available with Expat. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
no, but yeah, that we did this podcast like a few months before she passed away, and on that, I think it's all on the podcast. Her telling me the purpose of my
all
life is to
right.
communicate, and also me saying my next book will be called The Black Album, and she was like
Oh, okay.
very supportive. So weird little tie in there, but anyway,
Well, thank you for sharing that. All right. Well,
yeah,
I'm going to ask you another question here. I got two more. Is that cool? And then
yeah, totally,
talk
yeah.
about whatever goes on from there, or we can shut up if we feel like it. But all right, this is a relatively simple question compared to what
Mhm.
I've asked you so far. You recently founded New Ritual Press with your friend Dan Baltic. To my knowledge, you've published one book so far, Omar
Mhm.
King's An Odyssey of Dingbats, which I love and have blurbed. And I'm very happy for you and Omar that it's getting so much traction. But tell me more about the press, if there's anything else lined up, and your relationship to Dan Baltic and what brought you together to do this.
Yeah. No, thank you for this one. Dan, as I alluded to earlier, wasn't is my podcast co-host for New Right podcast. So we've known each other for several years. We met on a forum. Justin Murphy, who's another oddball figure who no need to dive into right now. Not
Okay.
exactly right wing, I guess like quasi conservative. He had like a forum for it's called Indie Thinkers to get independently minded people together. Me and Dan started the podcast from there. He's always been kind of the I'm a little more reserved, like, oh, does the world need another podcast? Does the world need another press? I'm the guy asking those questions. Dan has always pushed us on and on. So he, yeah, was basically the press was his idea, and I came around to it, I guess. But I
Okay.
came around to it. I think I might have said this on the podcast we did with Omar. I came around to it after I met Omar because I realized the potential in a press or the best version of starting a press is so you can meet people and put their work out there.
Right.
Versus, I wasn't, and I'm not interested in um, competing to be the hot press or like fighting to publish this online celebrity's book. The process for me is like, oh, I can actually meet people and help them, and then also put my little press insignia on it as a sign that we helped them. Like that's the way I approach it. It's a collaborative process. We have only put out one book, which is really not that bad because we only really launched a few months ago. It's a struggle for me. This is all kind of a labor of love, really. If I had a lot more time to put into it, we would have already published a few more. As is, we're just kind of kicking around different titles. I don't know if I'm supposed to announce any of them, but I
All
can
right.
say that
That's
we
fine.
have.
Okay.
I can say that we have a few in the can. There's a book. I This one I'm really excited about because I just finished it. A book called Dryback by a writer named Juan Echi, who doesn't have much of a following at this point. But that's sort of what I'm pretty jazzed about. But also, there's other stuff. And yeah, we'll of course be doing Omar's next book.
Of
He's
course. Of
been
course.
talking to me about that, and a few others. But
Okay.
yeah, hopefully one, maybe two more before the end of the year would be good. Really, we just need more time, and we're figuring it out. But yes, New Ritual Press, newritualpress.com. We're very proud of what we've accomplished even thus far. We have a sick logo. I think the vibe. We've thrown some good parties. We're throwing another
Yeah, yeah.
party next month, or this month now, June 21st. It's been a little hectic at times, but we're proud of what we put out. And of course, Odyssey of Dingbats is a runaway success by indie book standards, and that's only I won't take much credit for that. That's mostly Omar's genius, but yeah,
He has become quite a, I mean, he's a character anyway, but like
yeah,
his ability to just like get shit done or just organize people or I don't know what it is. Like I definitely don't have that same drive or or
yeah,
ability. But
no, absolutely, yeah,
he's also just so endearing in person, and
Yeah, that
like
that goes a long way.
yeah.
People, you want to be someone who people meet and then want to buy the book
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
and it should be about the literature, but of course it ends up being about the personality too. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that you can entirely separate that. But at the same time, like if the book sucked, I don't think you would get the same
Oh,
thing. Yeah, like
totally. Yeah.
he has a really distinct voice, and that's immediately obvious when you read his
Yeah.
work. So
And
I
it's
don't
a
know.
pleasure to read. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
it's also so fucking funny to read out loud. And I think like a lot of people, and I find a lot of like my work that I'm most proud of even is like doesn't really work in front of an audience a lot of the
Hmm.
time. Because you're like building this subtle thing over many, many pages. Whereas Omar's shit, like you read a paragraph and like everyone's laughing already. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And of course, especially when he himself reads it, which is another huge piece of the puzzle. No one, yeah, I mean, I think I'll say this. I've gone to a lot of these readings, obviously. I don't think I've ever seen someone who is as compelling of a performer of their own work as Omar, and that's huge. He'll
Yeah.
be in New York too. It'll be New
Okay.
York's Omar's New York debut. Yeah.
Okay. Fuck yeah. I think there's three people. Well, maybe if I include Dennis Cooper, it's four. I think he's actually a great reader, but
Oh yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
Meg McCarville comes to mind. Do you know who that is? She was published with
I know the
Amphetamines.
name.
Anyway, we don't need
Yeah.
to get into that. That's a whole nother thing, but it's one of
Yeah.
the funniest readings I've ever been witness to. Okay. This is my last real question here, and then we'll see where this conversation goes.
Yeah.
I want to talk about a concept you bring up in your essay, Renaissance of the Ritual. And it's something I've witnessed and participated in to a certain degree, having been involved in a sort of transgressive literary scene and at least being a spectator to dissident right-wing online spaces. And this is really my interpretation of what you're writing about. In the literary spaces I inhabit, there is an emphasis put on aesthetics, craft, the beauty and structure of a sentence, a typeface, a cover. Yet much of the content in these books is what many would call profane. In dissident right wing spaces, I get the feeling that there's an emphasis on morality and structure. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but yet so much of the discourse, so to speak, is entrenched in provocation and kind of edgelord behavior.
Hmm.
You write that the squeamish fact for conservatives and traditionalists is that we must affirm amoral vitalism as a force in itself, before we can affirm the rechannelings into moralism, into system, into civilization that we love so much. Things start as an immoral chaos, a formless mess, and the morality, the channelings, and the binding and cultivating forces of system are applied later. Can you talk about what you mean by this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for quoting that. It's always nice to hear something from your own work that's like, yes, I agree with myself, and I wrote it in a way that was not terrible.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm trying to not. I keep have this tendency that some would say is Sagittarian, to go very big in my answers to these questions and then get lost. But I, before I'm interested in politics, um, and I told this to your friend Luca Fisher when she got the book, and I was trying to explain myself because obviously she's not exactly dissident right. And I said like just as a caveat, like whatever is in there politically, I consider myself like an esotericist first. I consider myself an esotericist before I consider myself anything politically. And
Okay.
but what I mean by esotericist is someone who is interested in the study of energy, not in like a physics way, but in a Jungian occulty energies, my energy, your energy, masculine energy, feminine energy, sun energy, moon energy kind of way.
Okay.
So a lot of the stuff in that Renaissance of the Ritual essays is concerned with that question of energy. What did I mean by the quote that you brought up? Everything's let me say this in a not stupid way. Um,
It could be a little stupid. I mean, whatever.
maybe, yeah, or in a way where I'm just not just saying the thing that you quoted over again, but maybe even that would be helpful at this point. Um,
I could read it again if you want.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Right, right. So the quote shit. It's okay. So it's the squeamish fact for conservatives and traditionalists is that we must affirm amoral vitalism as a force in itself before we can affirm the rechannelings into moralism, into system, into civilization that we love so much. Things start as an amoral chaos, a formless mess, and the morality, the channelings, and the binding and cultivating forces of system are applied later.
Yeah. So before there is politics, before there is language, there is energy. There is, the energy of orgasm, for instance. There is the energy that music channels. There is the energy of a mosh pit. These are the kind of things I talk about in that essay. And like what I think both like the right side of the spectrum and at times the left side of the spectrum want to claim that energy for themselves because that energy, if we are talking about orgasm, for instance, or even if we're talking about the mosh pit or the catharsis of the mosh pit or even of violence, we kind of all love that and recognize that it is the marrow of the bones of life. I mean, can we say that? I don't know. Other people would be like
Um,
more squeamish, but like that is life. Is that mess? Is that energy? And I know it's very hippy dippy to put it that way, but I think a lot of people will know what I mean. There's a vital force that is pre-rational, pre-linguistic, pre-everything. Um, I don't think that's I don't think you have to be especially an occultist or religious to kind of recognize like there is a some kind of vital force
yeah.
behind things. Um, that particular quote, I think, was concerned with a kind of a more conservative or traditionalist view of the world at this sort of late stage of civilization, shall we say, that's very concerned with the rules and the order as it has previously been and getting back to that. But if all you're concerned with is going back, and this could be a criticism leveled at, I guess, conservatives from both a left wing perspective, but also even from like a dissident right perspective as well. If all you're concerned with is going back to the rules because everything used to be better when these rules were in place, but you don't recognize what those rules were in place to channel and cultivate, then all you're doing is worshiping language, worshiping the idea of a structure stands the energy behind it. Does this make any sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, part of like coming across your work at this point in my life is interesting to me because I think it's obvious to anyone listening to this, unless you just happen to find this conversation like randomly, is that, I used to do porn and that was a big part of my life and that has a lot
Mm,
of connotations associated with it. And um I've made a huge amount of effort to get out of that, and I look back on it in a somewhat nuanced way, but less and less nuanced. I actually don't really think it was that beneficial for me, other than maybe like a year or two to develop some like sense of self-esteem around
mm,
my
yeah,
sexuality and my personhood at maybe 19, 20, 21 years old. But beyond that, I don't know. I think I developed a lot of ideas about myself and about the world that had a sort of arbitrary morality attached to it. And as I grew up and got into more traditional relationships, I had a really specific yearning for something that I think a lot of people would identify as conservative. And
yeah,
I don't necessarily have that political leaning, though I don't really know what that means at this point.
hmm,
I have sort of distanced myself from a lot of the more obnoxious parts of left-wing ideology that you see in the culture. And yet, everyone I speak to who sits in a political spectrum, who I am friends with, always gives the caveat of their belief systems when compared to whatever is presented on like social media or the news is, well, that's not real left-wing ideology, or that's not real right-wing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like that's where space we're in. But you
Guilty as charged. Yeah.
you bring up this idea in your book, which, maybe just like very conservative 101 shit, but about striving for a moral life or whatever that means. And yet you're interested in a lot of the same things I am, at least from an aesthetics point of view, and delve into extreme violence and sexuality in your work. And so I feel like there's kind of a meeting point, and it makes
Definitely.
me very interested in your ideas and wanting to read your work. And so I don't know. I'm curious what all of those kinds of concepts mean for you, because I think they are inspiring in me also a way to like look at my past and see like all of these things that I've done, which have, I've been a literal fucking hooker, and I have had put my sexuality in all these sort of very extreme spaces in my real life that have done this and that, and I
Hmm.
am trying to channel them into very specific, I guess, moral structures at this point in my life.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I really believe in concepts of marriage and monogamy and stuff like that, and I've done
Yeah.
the exact opposite of that for most of my life. I'm not, and can I really look at someone else and be like, well, you're fucking amoral for doing that? I mean, I don't know. It's sort of like throwing rocks at myself. But at the same time, I don't think that those are behaviors that really benefit people in the long run, if I'm to be perfect.
Yeah. No, no, definitely. I mean, I'm a big believer in shadow work. I think sometimes you have to do the opposite of what you ought to do in order to find your path, if that makes sense. Again, interested in opposites. So, I look at someone like you and it's like, not to make it more too personal about you, but to me, and this would differentiate me from a lot of a more hectoring kind of conservative voice, but to me, it's like there's not really a contradiction in you having done all that, gone through all of that, and wanting something different now. In fact, it really speaks to the fact that it speaks to the validity of the ideas, I guess, that you've experienced the opposite thing so thoroughly that you can truly, you know, say that it's something more traditional that you want. A lot of people, I'm not one to give anybody life advice, whether it's someone who's doing porn or maybe a hooker or someone who's like getting married at 20. I mean, yeah, I don't really feel comfortable telling either person how to live their life, but I think there's absolutely ultimately something to be said for something like marriage and monogamy. That's a channeling of the erotic urge, a channeling of eros into family or whatever it is ultimately. And I do think that's good. And I think it's good for society. But I also don't think we live in a society right now that really incentivizes that in many ways at all. Like, I think it's great when I see people who want to live this more traditional life, but we don't live in a world where the benefits of that are the same as they once were, unfortunately. And like maybe it would be,
I
that's
agree.
I guess a more conservative part of me is like it probably would be better if we did, but we don't. So in the meantime, I'm much more interested in people exploring these questions for themselves and having skin in the game, as you clearly have. You know, I'm not saying one thing morally one way or the other about your life up to this point or anything. That's not the type of thing I'm interested in doing. But I think that the meaning, there's two different. There could be two wildly diverging paths, but maybe they end in the same place, and you can learn on either path. I regret I'm being as abstract as I am, but suffice it to say, again, interested in energy before I'm interested in telling people exactly how to live their life. Like I'm extremely, I'll say this with regard to porn and sexuality and all of it. Like I'm extremely, and I think you are too, extremely reverent of the power of sexuality. For
Yeah.
me, past a certain point, that reverence for the power of sexuality makes me more conservative about sexual matters because I think they should be handled with great care. That being said, like I never did porn, but certainly I've watched plenty of it. You know what I mean? Like I'm not separate from this. I'm also very
Right.
modern, and I know I don't think it's like ruined my life. I think that it's very sad in many ways what it what it can do to people. But like I'm also just kind of accepting it's where we are, and I also do think things can be learned. Not necessarily not I do think things can be learned from porn, not in a way that necessarily makes porn great, but like for example, like we'll talk about your work a little bit too, I guess. Like Body to Job is like a fantastic read, not just be
Thank you.
not as a caution. I mean, probably a little bit of a cautionary tale, but not simply as a cautionary tale. Also as an exploration of sexuality within porn, within the 21st century. Um, I'm interested in these things on their own. Destructive and bad things happen within porn, within modern sexual mores, but like, I'm doing, whether or not it's sexual, I'm doing destructive and chaotic things to my body all the time. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Obviously, like there's a right wing conservative thing of like striving for order, morality, and perfection, but like realistically, we are all falling very short of that all the time, and the falling short is as interesting, or honestly, usually even more interesting than actually achieving the thing. I just kind of have this tragic yin and yang dance understanding of that. It's not that there's no morality or that like degenerate things are as good as holy things, but like I think they're deeply, deeply intertwined in a way that in a way that is eternal. It's an eternal dance, and we'll never transcend it fully in this life, and maybe we don't even want to.
Yeah, you're probably right. Well, I mean, that's probably, I mean, that was a great answer. I don't know. I forget where the starting point to that conversation point was.
Yeah.
Yeah, fuck yeah. Okay. Well, I have run out of questions. Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Um, I'm tempted to say just more to clarify. I'm kind of cognizant that a lot of the people, or maybe even most or almost all of the people watching this, aren't going to be like right wing themselves, and I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea of me. What I'll say is, and I think what makes this hard to talk about is that I think things have changed even within the past like 1 year. And a lot of the Black Album it was basically written between 2020 and 2022, which now all of it's like 3 years old. I don't disavow really any of it, but I was kind of in a different phase of life where I was maybe more directly influenced by some of these dissident right type ideas, Bronze Age Pervert being a major feeder into it. Um, and I think that was kind of the specific product of a cultural moment. Obviously, Trump winning the election in 2016, but then as much that as him losing in 2020 and people trying to figure it out during COVID, looking at different ideas. Um, and we're in just a completely different moment now. So I think I certainly think my own book is still worth reading, but it is kind of rooted to a few years ago, in a way that maybe has changed a bit now.
I mean, fair enough. I don't entirely know what you mean by that, but I can make my own assumptions. I mean, from my reading of the book, it's not specifically well, we already talked about this, but you're not promoting any specific political ideology. I think in the latter part of the book, you go into this a little bit more, but you talk about some things that I think I have had now so many conversations about with predominantly left-wing people. Like you bring up, I think this is a real world thing that happened to you while you were in college, that it was sort of a very left-leaning, almost like anarcho-political
Yeah.
group of people who ended up burning books while you were in school, who were, I think
Yes.
it's become
Yeah.
part of modern culture to understand that like the left, especially during the Trump administration, became kind of like the censorial party. And now,
Yeah. That's
right, so there, I think
totally. Yeah.
But I think a lot of people, even when I bring up this type of thing, like encountering more and more young people who lean right, and I talk to my older left-wing friends about it. Initially, a lot of them have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about, and then a lot of them brush it off as kind of a reactionary movement just because of how silly kind of online space has become, like this sort of like tattletale woke shit. Um, and I don't know exactly what that means then. Is that dissident right wing ideology like actually stands for something? I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
Does it actually scam?
Is it in your
Go on.
opinion actually like a reactionary movement just because how insane the left has become? Or is there like an any sort of thread that holds it together to be like we stand for this? I guess that was sort of my first question that we didn't really get
Yeah.
to.
And now maybe we can get to it now. I mean, I think that as a whole, the slop yard that is Elon Musk's X. All right, I don't want to be too negative about whatever. I don't want to piss anyone off.
Yeah,
But taken as a whole, it's pretty damn reactive. Like pretty damn and yes, I'll stand by that. It's reactive for a good reason. Like the way I got here, and maybe I'm ultimately more of a conservative leaning person in my personal life, and maybe that was my inevitable path. But the way I got from being like a Clinton voter in 2016, which I was, to interested in dissident right ideas was it's such a tired talking point, but it's inevitably part of the history. Was woke overreach? Was
right,
anarcho type people burning books? Was you can't say anything because you're a white male
right.
type of stuff. Which like people, I try not to bitch and moan about it because it has gotten a lot. It has gotten substantially better since I was in college, but it was pretty bad then. And as someone who wanted to write books, purpose of my life being to communicate, I was I won't say I had no agency in it. And again, I'm not saying I'm not naturally a more conservative person, but I was essentially pushed to a place where if I wanted to have a voice or write books, it was going to be in a right leaning space. That basically happened to me. So that's kind of how I got there. Um. Anyway, that's a little bit of tangent, but further
No, I mean,
further
look,
me further me explaining myself.
I don't
Um.
think that that's an unusual point of view, just to speak out loud.
That's
It is
why.
something
Yeah.
I had this conversation with many people who don't associate themselves even with right-wing ideology. I mean, just men in general over the past 10 years
Completely. Yeah. And
feel a little bit fucking pissed because of exactly what you're talking about.
yeah.
Um,
That has gotten better. I think Gen
yeah,
Z on both the left and the right is a little more wary of how stupid and self-defeating that kind of thing is. So
sure, sure.
younger lefties are probably way better than my contemporaries were in college. And well, I'd always love to have a conversation with such people. But yeah, so to answer your question, taken as a whole, inevitably it is reactive to something that was worth reacting against, but it's the dissident right, whatever, is basically just a knee jerk, like not that. That has its place. But I do think if there is a better common thread, I would say that it was partially or largely the purpose of the Black Album, at least for me, because that's subjective, right? There's
Okay.
kind of a more traditional Catholic thread that is pretty alien to me, despite or perhaps because I grew up Catholic. Like I'm not so into that like real like traditional religious shit. I'm more into yeah, like the more affirmative, Nietzschean core that very much explored in that renaissance of the ritual essay and elsewhere in the book. For me, was represented best of all by Bronze Age Pervert, but also an element of it within Mike Ma, even within Delicious Tacos in a funny way. And I don't know if I can say that that is the beating pulse of what the dissident right has always been or has become. But to me, that more let's call it vitalist element would be the more common thread within the dissident right. And it's not like I go around saying I'm a card carrying member of the dissident right or anything, but inevitably the associations are there, and I'm not going to disown them. And as far as it's part of my like intellectual and personal development, it has to do with that vitalism. What is that vitalism? I don't want to. I wish I had a better, more portable way of just expressing it, but tying into some of those talking points we are talking about earlier with like the basic energy behind things, and certainly masculinity and um the ideal of that kind of energy being free and being free to go forth and multiply. That Yeah, sometimes traditionally conservative structures have stifled in many ways, and certainly within my own lifetime I found to be extremely stifled by, I could say, left leaning society, but really just society in general. That question of what do you do with masculine energy, always seemed to be to stifle it, to push it away. But to me, that is the vital energy behind civilization itself and the greatest works of art, and just the greatest human achievements. And I mean, sorry, I'm speaking very romantically and broadly here, but spitball a tiny bit further here. I mean, I think tying this all together, maybe it's like, Dennis Cooper is obviously quite left wing, right? But to me, what attracted me to his work really broadly is the same thing that attracted me to Bronze Age mindset, which is the exploration of that um, essential cathartic energy that to me is the meaning of life.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, look, Dennis's work, I mean, you said at the beginning or like early on in this conversation that both Brett and Dennis's work ha live in this kind of queer space, and yet they've attracted an enormous following of heterosexual men. I mean, I think you
Yeah.
can't deny that. And, my sexuality is a little bit elusive. I would say I'm predominantly straight leaning, even though I've had sex with many, many men, mostly for money, but sometimes not. So it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to really talk about that in like what, but
I
anyway,
mean, I'll
yeah.
throw myself out there, like different than you, but I mean, I think in my work too, yeah, I'm like straight leaning, but there's some real nuance in my stuff, which
I picked
people
up
can
on that.
find.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you definitely get into
yeah,
this sort of like homoerotic
oh yeah. I mean,
deep.
yeah, that's like two steps down
Yeah.
from a lot of the stuff, and even like Bronze Age pervert. I don't know what the prevailing theory is, but there's a lot of speculation about his sexuality. I mean, it's
Sure, because
yeah,
he's posting fucking like shredded topless men
yeah.
on almost every one of his X updates. And I don't I think you can only read so much into that. But what I mean with like Dennis's stuff, not that this is like some I don't know what is the actual word like I mean, the universe is almost entirely made up of men in his work. I mean,
Yeah,
there is like occasionally a friend or a mother or someone, but there's not really a character in this work that has anything at stake, especially
yeah.
because this is so enmeshed in male sexuality. And if you want to call that queer sexuality, fine. But the fact that I don't really think that that's the audience. And I think if you put this like in the queer section in a bookstore, which it often is,
I saw it in Barnes and Noble recently. I was like, there, whoever picks that up randomly
yeah, but it's
was
like
closer. Yeah,
it's not the
yeah,
point. And I think that's
right.
very clear to anyone who reads it. And and I think he's made that very clear. And I think for the fact that like, I would go out on a limb and just say like I'm gonna guess most of his readers are men.
Yeah. Oh, Dennis Cooper. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I certainly know some girls who read him, but like, I
Yeah.
think in the same way, it's funny. In the same way, I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, I like a lot of female coded literature too. In the same way that someone could say like, "Oh, you got to be a girl to really appreciate my year of rest and relaxation," which is
Right.
probably true. I love that book, but
Me
I
too,
would
but
understand that. Yeah, you maybe have to be a woman. Yeah, the same with Dennis Cooper. Like, no doubt in my mind. And there's other queer literature that maybe that isn't as clearly true for. Like a lot of women love like certainly gay erotica, but Dennis Cooper is tapping into something very different. I think there's stuff in Dennis Cooper that you almost have to be a male to really get, that level of violence or something. Of course, being incorrigibly sexist here, but
well, I was even talking to like you mentioned her earlier, my friend Luca Fisher, who is a trans woman, but
Mhm.
grew up for a certain part of her life as a man, and but this wasn't really a conversation that was coded in gender, but I was bringing up just like the fact that my initial response to something like Bret Easton Ellis's work was not that it was a social critique or that had anything to do with like you know, well, it was parody is the wrong word here, but a lot of people look at like the movie American Psycho because it was directed by is it her name
Mary Herron,
Mary
Mary Herron. Yeah,
Harron, who was a lesbian woman, and I think she was sort of transforming that text into a feminist work, kind of. But I think most men don't approach it that way, and I
yeah,
think that is still people post these things on the internet like, oh, like you don't fucking understand. Like Patrick Bateman is not someone to look up to. But I think if you read this as a young man, you can't help it. And
yeah,
Luca was pointing out the fact that like there's a theory that you cannot make an anti-war film if you actually show the violence because something about that is actually enthralling. And
yeah.
if it's horrifying and it shows how fucked up this is, it's actually quite enticing. And most people are going to go into that. And I think particularly young men are going to be attracted to it, not because it's terrible, but because they see something in that they are actually identify with.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm not like pro war or something, but I would say this little tidbit gives me something to sink my teeth into about defining myself in some of these terms like right wing, left wing. I would say in as far as I am right of center, part of it has to do with yeah, taking that fact, that basic fact that young men are going to be enthralled by stuff in a war movie. And I have, again, not affirming all wars or something, but I have an
Yeah, I
affirmative
mean, that's
response
not
to
what I'm
that.
saying either, to be
Oh
clear.
yeah, yeah. No, to be clear, I just thought that was kind of that's an interesting point. I feel like to be left wing, particularly in a moralistic way, is to rue that basic fact, like that there is something enthralling in violence, as if this is somehow a problem to be fixed.
Right.
I'm not trying to be unfair. I think there are sort of more vitalist left wing factions too, certainly historically, anarchists,
Yeah.
whatever. But to me, kind of a lot of, in as far as I am right of center politically, a lot of it has to do with like, no, like we have to find a way to affirm that basic fact about us as humans, and again, channel it properly into
Okay.
a more just war, a more just struggle. I mean, it branches out to much bigger questions like what struggle in so many ways is what, and this is a very right wing talking point that they'll stand by, struggle in so many ways is what brings out the best in humanity. But like, what do you do when there's no obvious struggle, when, we're kind of all well fed and civilization is going the way it's going? I mean, I think that is where a lot of dissident right ideology comes out of is this, not that there aren't huge conflicts in the world, but we're kind of, as Carl Schmitt said, we kind of, modern man has been put out to pasture. That is kind of the issue, and this has come up in some people's reviews of the Black Album. It's like, what does that mean? You then create struggle or like rebel again, or commit violence for its own sake? I mean, obviously not, but like there are serious questions about like what to do with our natural masculine at times, urges towards struggling for something higher in society the way it is, and that's where you get. Sorry, I feel like I'm just spitballing now, but
No, no, it's fine.
why is bodybuilding so big on the right? It's because there's this inherent need to fight and struggle for something, and it gets cringe when it's like I'm just a bodybuilder and I'm not doing anything with it. But like that, it's the masculine. It all comes back to the question of what to do with masculine energy, which has not been adequately answered by society. But that my work explores sometimes in a right leaning way, but also that I think like Dennis Cooper and even certain queer coded stuff explores really well.
I agree with you. I mean, yeah. Anyway, great. I am a big fan of the Black Album. I don't really think you need to have any sort of belief system to enjoy it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I certainly am not really espousing any specific ideology in this point in my life, and I think it's a phenomenal work. So I hope people pick it up. At the end of this conversation, I think that's all I really want to say is like, thanks for being on here. I appreciate you having this conversation with me. If
Yeah, I
anyone,
appreciate it. Yeah.
yeah, I kind of front loaded this conversation with the ideological thing because it's sort of like if you can't get past that, then the rest of this conversation is
Right.
moot.
Yeah.
You know, there are people who hold biases and whatever. That's just the way it is. So,
I would go as far as say I understand, it's not going to be for everybody, but I hope if you did stick around to this point in the conversation that I've made some kind of sense. And I love talking to people about these kinds of things. I'm pretty accessible over social media. Um, so yeah, I'm hoping I want to connect actually with more
yeah.
people outside of any kind of right wing political bubble at this point. I'm tired of it. So
Fuck yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
And
Well,
thank you for having me on, Chris. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, I'll try to get this out as soon as possible. I don't know what that means. It kind of depends on my work, but
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, we'll see each other hopefully soon. It sounds like you had a bunch of readings and shit, and Omar
Yeah.
is constantly inviting both of us to everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I may go to this one on the 12th. We'll
Yeah.
see.